Welcome to the Stars Ryan.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the one and only Hooman Radfar. Here we go. You have a mic? Okay, great. Yeah, there's your mic right there.
Hello.
How's it going?
Overwhelmed with joy.
Yeah?
Thank you.
So you
Way to start. I was very tired. Now I'm awake. You haven't given me awake.
you just came back from taking the metro.
Yes, the metro is not doing well on Orange Line. Public service warning.
Sure. So hey, thanks for making out here. We always like to start our fireside chat on sort of a personal note. So let's go way back. Where you born? Where you raised? And perhaps maybe you can talk about what you have a very fascinating family story. Talk about your parents, what they did, and then just maybe perhaps your first entrepreneur experience as a child. So let's start with you.
All right. So let's reach back. I haven't talked about this in a long time, so I might get teary. I was born in London. So my parents, I'm Persian, if you didn't notice. And my parents were, I don't know what the right word is, leaving the Iranian Revolution. So around 1979, I was tucked away safely in my mom's belly. And we went to London, where I was born, and spent the beginning of my life there. And then we moved to Pittsburgh. And there's a pretty big healthcare system there. My parents are both physicians. They're in private practice, and they're both psychiatrists. So let the jokes ensue about what happened to me as a child. So grew up in Pittsburgh, and I spent most of my early years in terms of education in that area. So as you mentioned, I went to Penn undergrad. I studied computer science and economics, and then I went to Carnegie Mellon, and I studied electrical computer engineering with an emphasis on information networks, social networking specifically. Woo! So there you go.
So did you have a first entrepreneur experience? Lemonade stand, lawn mowing.
I
whatever?
did the standard stuff, I guess. Actually, so it's funny. My partners and I at my current company were just talking about this. I think everyone has mowed lawns. So does that count? So I had I had a pretty unsuccessful business there. I did not really get into it. So I would always have the bare minimum amount of lawns so that I could just have scratch for the weekend. So it wasn't really a great profit center. But I think the first experience that I had that is of note, which was an epic fail, was in college. So I was in school during the dot-com period. So at the beginning of college, everything was cool. Everyone was graduating with very little experience and making lots of money, and I was excited for that. And so around midway through, I saw these guys speak. This guy, Josh Kopelman. How many people know who Josh Kopelman is? So at the time, he had founded a company called half.com, which then sold to eBay. That's where I think he made a lot of his early fortune, and then he founded a company called First Round VC. So you might be more familiar with him through that. Anyway, I saw this guy speak, and he looks like me at that point, right? And he's talking about he started this company. I'm like, he'd graduated a couple of years before. And then in the same talk, I saw another guy named Andy Ratcliffe, who's one of the founders of Benchmark. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Benchmark. Same kind of deal. And I got to talk to these guys. I'm like, oh my gosh, you can actually do this. So growing up in Pittsburgh, that was not the case. I thought a banker was the guy behind the teller, and that's what you do. I thought consultants were people who didn't have jobs, and it was a very different environment. It was pretty traditional, so it was really eye-opening. And I decided to start a company, which I think right idea, maybe wrong execution and timing. So it was a video-on-demand company. I had read this article in Wired about a company called Netflix that was going to send out DVDs via postal. I thought, these guys are whack. The internet is out. Why would they do that? Let's do streaming. So I was about 6 years too early technology-wise. So we built this infrastructure with one of the professors and started to, we put in, at the time, all of our money. So it was like this egregious loss, so I think it was like 10 grand. And then the economy crashed. And on top of that, I lost all that day trading money. I don't know if you guys got to play in that too. And so it was this big, huge loss. So the two things I was working on both crashed and burned pretty hard.
That's like pretty entrepreneurial, like day trading. That's actually the first time I've ever heard. I mean, I've interviewed quite a lot, and no one's ever admitted they were a day trader.
I think I took $4,000, and at one point I had $80,000, and I was like, "This is awesome! I'm so good." And then what I realized is all of them were going up. Yeah, no, I didn't realize that.
Hey, so I mean, you're from Pittsburgh. Are you a diehard Steelers fan? I mean, obviously, right? Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
if I was to say anything else, that would be detrimental to my health.
Yeah, because this is taped, right? So
Yeah, no, I love the Steelers.
friends are gonna go after you if you don't. So who's your favorite all-time Steeler athlete?
Oh, wow.
Because I mean, this from a Pittsburghian to another one, like you sort of have to ask that question. So
I don't know. I was always partial to wide receivers, so I like Lynn Swann. Franco Harris was a big one. Actually, you know what? I take it back. Jerome Bettis. He's just nice. He smiles a lot. I like him.
okay, one last question about
Sure.
Steeler. But how's the season looking for this coming year? I mean,
I don't know.
Like-
I'm so confused right now, too.
Yeah.
And I'm a recent transplant to San Francisco, so I have all these Niners fans around me give me grief. So I hope we do well, but we might need to restock.
go. Hashtag startup grind at Hooman Radfar, right?
Sure.
Okay. Please tweet out.
Tweet. Do it.
HQ is watching, so
Cause a trend. I'll say really weird stuff.
so let's talk about Carnegie Mellon. First of all, isn't Carnegie Mellon the best institution ever? I mean, right?
I think so, yeah.
Here we go. Yeah, let's
Yeah.
give it there. All right.
Yeah.
Carnegie Mellon's awesome.
Everything.
Better than Cornell, right?
I think so.
Totally, right?
Yeah, at everything.
There's some Cornell folks in here, that's why.
Okay. It's still better.
Did you, so you started, like, let's, from the beginning here, before, the company, ClearSpring, you had you were researching at CMU, it had a research project on analytics on social networks, right? And back that time, Facebook wasn't all that big. It was MySpace, right? Right?
Yeah, Facebook didn't exist.
Yeah, Facebook. Okay, Facebook didn't exist. So what made you think yes, we got to go into analytics in social network? Like what was sort of that aha moment? You're like I think this is going to be pretty big. Like to kind of take us back, when you were at CMU. Like what was your thinking there?
So I'll caveat this with something I really believe in. So history is written backwards. So when I sum up my story in bullets, it looks very elegant and well thought out, but there's a lot of entropy, at high resolution magnitude. So I'll give you the real deal because you were kind enough to come. So I had no idea, actually. When I went to school, I look at entrepreneurship and life in general as a series of projects, and I took a lot of small steps quickly that got me to where I was. So the first interest I had was in college, obviously the dot-com boom, which was entrepreneurship and the internet. That was just fascinating. And the idea of computers as a network versus, at the time, it was all PC and software. I mean, remember download.com? I mean, the network was kind of secondary at the time. So I became really fascinated with that, started researching networks. That's what I actually started in grad school, researching high-speed networks, because I wanted to do the video-on-demand thing. So I was convinced that that's what I was going to do, which, again, in retrospect, might have been interesting given all the activity around video. So wasn't wrong, but what I found out was what I really enjoyed was social networking. And I just happened to pick up a paper on graph theory describing social networks. It's the same math for social networks and high-speed networks. So I thought that was cool, and I was like, Orkut came out, LinkedIn had come out. There's a thing called Tribe that Mark Pincus had. And I thought to myself, if these things get big, and the speed at which they were growing was insane. So I thought if these things get big, they can really be the center of something massive. So I just kept stepping towards that, and then we'd started the company. What we saw quickly was there was this huge amount of funding. It was around 2005, 2006 is when the infusion of capital started, and this was, at the time we thought the big infusion, but we were really wrong. So I would say we saw well over $200 million going to networks like Tagged, High Five, probably a lot of them you don't know, maybe some of you do know them. And we said the opportunity isn't just building a social network. There's an enabling infrastructure that we can build to help all website publishers, developers reach these networks. So it was just happening to keep walking down the line of interests and what we were good at.
So tell us the moment where you have this, I guess, prototype, and then it turned into a real company, a real product. In your first year, his company, they got 100 million uniques. Okay, so I wanted to just go into the very, very beginning, right? So product, going to market, that first 100 user, let's go from the beginning. Like, how did that happen?
So I left. So we were in Pittsburgh at the time. We got our first $2 million infusion, and there was 3 of us. So we literally packed our bags, I think within a week, found places, and started bouncing. And I was on my cell phone calling buddies from school, trying to convince them to join us. So 2 weeks later, I think I'd convinced maybe 3 or 4 guys, one of which is still actually with the company today. He's one of our VPs of product. And we just started building. And the first thing we did, honestly, was we started just talking to a lot of these developers. And what we noticed, every single developer we talked to, was that they were just hacking their way into social networks. So the first innovation that we had was actually a minor one, but an important one in the history of the company. Was MySpace didn't have an API. No one had APIs, actually. So you had to have a developer go in and code like a JavaScript thing, and you did this 10, 20 times to add all the buttons. So at the time, that was actually a ton of work. So when we were talking to them about, well, what do you need? Like, what are you afraid of social networks? They're like, we just want to get our stuff over there. So we were like, okay, we'll do that for you. We literally just did that. And at the time, people were posting what's called widgets. So MySpace was a big profile, if you remember. It wasn't the stream. And so we said, okay, we'll make that super easy. And we started with that. We prototyped it actually with AOL. And AOL was one of our first.
Was that your first product, though? So those the AOL widget?
Yeah, they would post using our tools. And then we just looked at our server logs, and we noticed the volume was insane of the posts.
So let's do that. So you launch it.
Yeah.
First day, what did it look like? Second day, a week? I mean,
I don't remember first days and first weeks, but I can tell you a couple weeks in, we had NBA do it, and we had, I think it was something like 400,000 page views one day. And it was like within weeks. And we're like, holy crap, this is a lot of data. And then they would call us. So the Colts called us. They were using it, and they said, this is really cool, but we don't know what's happening. And so they kept asking us for requests. And at the time, I'm embarrassed to say, we built our, we were just kind of measuring stuff and putting it into an access database or something really crappy. And it was like breaking. So we hired our CTO, Stuart Allen, who was coming from Web Methods. And he started to actually look at the live stream of the data. And he was like, yeah, you probably have about 3 months till everything collapses. So we rebuilt everything on the fly, and it was very stressful. So I think what happened, though, was a lot of the Valley started getting wind of this stuff, and it was those companies using our infrastructure that really drove it after we had a couple really marquee proof points with, believe it or not, major brands.
So, I know you jumped into saying you raised $2 million, but before that, you had raised $100,000 through friends and family in a grant. I think
yeah,
it was a
there was
foundry.
A lot of different stuff.
So because a lot of startups are sort of in that phase right now, right? I mean, $2 million, that's it's hard to do that already. So going from the beginning,
yep,
you're creating with that $100,000 a grant. Were you still trying to figure out this product market fit with that $100,000 before getting that $2 million locked?
Sure.
Okay, so explain that.
So when we first left graduate school, I'll never forget this. So we graduated, I think it was on the 8th of May we incorporated, and I had no clue what we were going to do the first day, that Monday. So I think we graduated around Thursday, Friday, and I remember talking to my co-founder, Austin, and he's like, so I'll see you on Monday where? It's like one of these really, you do all the business plan stuff and you talk to everyone about all this stuff, but what it ends up being is days. And what are you going to do the first minute and it was really stressful. So I'm like, let's go to Best Buy and buy a computer. And that was, we started with actually a $5,000 grant from Carnegie Mellon, and we hacked our way into this consulting gig for $25,000 that kept us eating over the summer while we figured it out. So we had nothing to do with anything. The first summer was just us trying to not starve.
That's interesting you say that, because Nigel Morris was one of our guests, and that's exactly how they sort of float the boat. They had a consulting gig. It was $200,000, and that's what they used to sort of create their first prototypes.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Can you kind of tell us when did? There's always the signals for startups, right? When you're raising money, everybody is sort of looking who is sort of the first seed investors, right? So you had Nigel Morris, Ted Leons. Those guys are a little later, though, right? Ted, Steve Case, Ron Conway with SV Angels. Was that in the seed round, or was that later in the Series A?
So we had people come in at various points. The first people I would say institutionally that came in that really made the leap was a guy named Phil Bronner from Novak Biddle. So he was a CMU Penn alum. One of our advisors introduced me to him, I'd say a year before he invested. And it was mostly to convince me about how we were just totally wrong about what we were doing, which we were. So I got on the phone with him, and it was an interesting, one of those, like, if you've ever talked to VCs when they're not interested in your business, they use the word interesting, not I'm interested. It's just always remember, interesting does not equal interested. So I was really jazzed, and I called my advisor, and I said, man, he's so it's interesting. And he said, yeah, no, he's not. Is he say to call him back? I said, no, well, all right. So, yeah, and then we actually did a tour in the Valley. I think we talked to 20, I didn't even remember the number, but we talked to so many VCs, and it was no. And so it was a really rough period for us trying to figure out where we fit in the ecosystem, especially coming from Pittsburgh. I mean, 2 guys with no work experience.
So tell us the time when you picked up your bag from Pittsburgh to go to the DC. This is really fascinating because this is going to be one of the questions I'm going to ask you a little later. But you had a chance to go to New York, Silicon Valley, but you went to DC. Was that sort of because of the investors had told you to do that, or they said, here's your money and then you can go anywhere?
So, okay, looking back at it, so what happens when you're broke is a lot of reality comes in the decision. So it's actually kind of elegant. I don't know if any of you guys have ever are starting companies or started companies, there's a beauty to constraints. So when it's no money or some money, it's a left-right decision. And this happened to us a number of times. So we raised some money from our original seed investors, which was an economic development agency. And we went out, we were doing, Pittsburgh was very much like enterprise. So they wanted us they're like, oh, Web 2.0, you guys should do this stuff for enterprises and sell, to them. And it wasn't even a bad idea. It was just not where we wanted to go. We figured out a different strategy, in part because when we went to Silicon Valley, we would show people what we were, at least some of the prototypes we were working on, and they were excited on a, hey, you should give this out for free. You should let it grow. And I had never heard anything like that before because I'm like, well, I'm not going to make any money. They're like, oh, who cares? So I came back and I realized that our pitch was just boring, It wasn't resonating. People, one guy tells you, you guys aren't doing great. 2 guys. When it gets to 10, you're pretty sure that you're doing something wrong. So we came back, we refactored, and actually our first investors, they gave us money in tranches. So that's what happens when you're in your 20s. And they pulled our last $75,000 on us. And they said, we're not going to give it to you if you guys go down this path of raising VC for this. And so we started burning out of money. I think when we raised our $2 million, I had about, $2,000-$3,000 left in the bank. So one more payroll, we would have been done.
Actually, you had many of those moments.
Probably, yeah.
At this, I mean, you had done a commencement speech at CMU, and you had talked about there was sort of a pivotal moment for you guys where one of the hardest decisions you made by laying off 20% of your company. But that's a little later. But I mean, you've had these sort of like near-death experience probably more often than you really wanted.
Probably more than I know. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I wanted to because it's so hard to put your head around 1.8 billion users, and 1.8 it's like here, but then okay, when you scale back, when you just reverse it, your 100 million users, that snapshot of the user is going to be completely different when you're 1 billion. 100 million that's going to be different than your 1 million, user base compared to your 100,000 user base, right? So I guess the question here is that, we're all trying to figure out some customer acquisition strategy, right? Were you guys sort of just figuring out, you're just sort of like a little minnow in the pond and we're going to figure it out as we go through this? When you got your first million user, right? Did you sort of have to kind of sit back and say, okay, let's figure out what the next strategy is for my customer acquisition? Was it sort of like that where you had to strategize on this? Customer acquisition is that's the bottom line I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great point, and I haven't thought about it in a long time in the sense of it really is different at each phase. So I was actually chatting with some of the guys at Y Combinator about this, and Paul Graham has this saying, do things that don't scale. And it's really, really true at the beginning. So we were literally going to conferences and trying to get people to install it in front of us, watching them do it. We were calling people. I mean, whatever we could do to get people to install it, to figure it out. And then at the same time, we were doing some optimization on our site. But you have to remember, in 2006, 2007, when we were funded, there was no Optimizely, split testing stuff. I mean, Google Analytics was very raw, just coming off of the brand Urchin, you know. So there weren't a lot of tools. So a lot of it was just us sitting in the servers. So the things we did at the very beginning were very different than when we had more scale. So once we had, call it 1 million, installs on websites, and we had hundreds of millions of uniques, the techniques we would use were different. For example, we started optimizing our PageRank a lot by actually instrumenting the tools so that all the tools pointed back to us and backlinked us. So now the company has, I don't even know, 200 million backlinks and a Google PageRank 10. So we're bigger than Facebook and Google in terms of SEO, which is crazy. But that was an architecture decision that we made early on that we doubled down on. So a lot of it is at each level of scale, recognizing that you actually can do things a little bit differently. So we started doing much more SEO, content marketing things. So for example, now we put out a content recommendation tool to compete with Outbrain and Taboola, and the team literally just linked to a blog post because we have PageRank 10, and it was in the top 3 search results. So we couldn't do that at the beginning. So I think a lot of it does change with scale, but at the very beginning, you have to do, I talked to the Reddit guys about this. They'll openly admit they were making up posts, just trying to make the network look lively. The MySpace guys were just putting up pictures of really good-looking people and friending everybody. It was really Wild West at that point, what people were doing. Because we were more developer-focused, there was less, I would say, suspicious activity that we can engage in, but we were hustling just as hard as anyone else.
So, hashtag startup grind at Hooman Radfar. I'd like to do a little switch gears here. I know that this is a topic that, especially our chapter here in DC, they like to talk about this topic more so than any of the chapters that I've seen because through the Q&A. So I want to talk about culture, the startup culture. What is startup culture? Again, I went to 500 startups, and it sort of looks like this, right? You see the ping pong tables, you see the neon lights, see Spock on the wall, and it's like, yeah. Is that culture? What is culture? How do you set culture in a startup?
This is a really tough one. So I would say that, to me, when I look at culture, it's one of the single most important things in a company. It's also the hardest to not only define, but actually nurture. And I think culture, honestly, is what happens is it's in your actions. So you can sit down and have this whiteboarding session with your team. You can write down all your values. You can say you're transparent. You can say you're open. But if you're not transparent, if you're not open in your meetings as leadership, your team is not going to enforce that. So I'm allowed to swear? Am I allowed to swear? Okay. I'm going to swear a little bit. So I wrote this post on Medium, shit rolls downhill. My ex-CRO became my president. She's now president of Loverly. Used to say this to me all the time. And one of the seminal lessons that I learned as an entrepreneur, and I think there's this programmer culture around, especially male founder CEOs who come from an engineering background, where it's okay to be this, hipster programmer who's kind of misogynistic, and it's cool, don't worry about it. And shit rolls downhill. So if you're going to be like that, then the people that report to you are going to be like that, and that's one problem. But the real problem is, what you'll realize is, you're going to grow up over the next 2 years, and you're going to go into some meeting, and you're going to see people doing things that you don't agree with, but it's stuff that you did 2 years ago because they hired some middle manager, inherited your behavior, and it just keeps going down and down and down. So I think, honestly, the single most important thing you can do with culture is to take the founding team, look at yourselves, not just write it down, but actually do those things. Because you have no idea the impact that you have with the little things that you do.
So still on the vein of culture here, how do you maintain it? Reggie Agrawal of Cvent had said, I think it's crazy companies that are less than 50 that I do not personally interview. Do you think that that's one way to maintain it, where the founders are interviewing and hiring the first few employees? They get thousands of people, it's a little bit harder, but is that one of the techniques to maintain culture and the DNA of the company?
I think that's a fine early hack. And I mean, I, for example, met every single employee up till when I left for lunch as a rule, and made sure that I had office hours where people could come in. I think you can interview, but that in itself is a culture, saying the founders know better. What I would probably prefer as a more scalable technique is that you constantly have the discussion with the team, making sure you reinforce the values, making sure that you actually, when you're making a decision, you bring up that value as as rationale for that, and it continues to scale across the team, because if you have success at a point, very quickly you can't do that interview, and then you have this broken system, right, where nobody knows what to do. And it's amazingly simple to write down 4 or 5 things, right? But it's also amazing how little people really don't do it. It's not that challenging to just start drafting it. Just as you're hacking away at your products, you should be hacking at your culture.
We're going to talk a little bit about Expo, but is that one of the components you look at? I mean, because 2 guys, you can't really tell what a culture, how that startup is culturally. Is that important to you when you're looking at early stage companies? How do you gauge your culture?
So I have 2 different lenses, I suppose. I do some investment and advisory, and I also have the Expo platform. And through both, what I found time and time again is the personality, attitude, and ideals of the founders tend to have more bearing on the future of the business than the initial idea. And that's not just lip service. That's actually really, really true. And because just imagine, like, statistically, what's the probability that the first time you pitch something really, really early is 100% right? It's probably not, right? So you're probably wrong. So what you look for is a person who's humble, hungry, and can actually hustle to make something happen, right? So they'll take advice, they'll take feedback, and they're asking the right questions. So yeah, they're probably a little bit off, but they can calibrate very quickly and actually are excited about that process of calibration. So I look at that as number 1, 2, and 3 importance in terms of investing.
What should startups look for in angel investors for seed funding? I mean, I know that, again, Nigel Morris is one investor that you and Haroon, he always talks about Nigel Morris. I mean, you had said that Nigel has been pivotal to your success. So what did you see? By the way, Nigel was one of our guests, by the way. He's a really cool guy. What did you see in him, and what was sort of the traits that you thought that was going to help you in your startup?
So I would say a couple things. One, I wouldn't look for a one-size-fits-all package with respect to angels in particular. Everyone's a bit different, and I think you need to, when you're an entrepreneur, you basically have infinite gaps, right? So let's say there's 2 founders. Maybe one's really good at coding and one's the business person, each having gaps in there. There's a lot of distance in there to fill in. So I would say the first step is look inward and see what you're not good at, where you need help, whether it be connections, for example, whether it be mentoring, whether it be whatever, and try to find people that can be aligned with accelerating you along those lines. And so if you can find, an angel investor who's willing to spend some time there, or an advisor, I think that can be pretty valuable. Nigel is a great example. So for me, he was honestly the first real management coach I ever had that spent a lot of time and taught me kind of very basic things. Because one of the weird things that happens with founders, especially if you grow something really fast, is there's this false positive on all of your decisions. So everyone thinks that a lot of the things you just know, and you tend to learn a lot and read on the internet, so you sound like you know what you're doing. But, some parts you do and some parts you don't. And that's the challenge, I think, for investors, frankly, interfacing with really smart entrepreneurs, is they sound like they know what they're doing, but they have certain areas where just like there's no depth, and they don't even know. So I would find people that can really hit those different points, but don't try to do one size fits all necessarily. There isn't one type. So SV Angel, for example, and Ron, markedly different investors than Nigel, but both absolutely amazing. Like, I would recommend SV Angel in a heartbeat, not because they spend time with you, but because they say they won't spend time with you, and they will route you to anyone you want in Silicon Valley. So they're actually giving you money to give you a network, which is an insane trade.
How do you look for those angels? So, I mean, Nigel. By the way, Nigel Morris is the co-founder of Capital One. Capital One is a $21 billion company. Co-founder. So it must have been pretty hard to get to him, right?
So what happened? Actually, Nigel was. It wasn't as bad as maybe it should have been, but It really depends on where you are in the cycle. So what happens with these communities, so the internet itself, in particular, consumer and enterprise, it's a very small network of people that are both investing in building companies. And so what ends up happening, Nigel was a bunch of these guys, Ted, Steve, Nigel Morris, were all getting into the game again. And so they were shuttling deals to each other. And so they all knew about, Webs and ClearSpring at the time, then AddThis, and a couple other, Power, like everyone knew each other. So it's so one of the advantages to being in a small community is that people have more visibility than you probably would guess, but they all talk. So with Nigel, actually, I believe one of our investors just said, hey, you're going to get along with him. He's an analytical guy, and he probably thinks more like you do, and he can teach you how to do business in a way that maybe fits your style.
So you guys are doing analytics of 1.8 billion users in practically real time, right? Is that a correct assessment?
In real time, yes.
In real time. So what are some of the, important behavior trends that maybe not everyone knows about that you find particularly interesting?
I don't know. This is getting recorded. So what we used to do, which is interesting, so just to give you a little bit of background on the types of data we see, why I'm going like this, you'll understand why it could be sensitive/hilarious. So our code is on 16 million pages now, reaching about 1.85 billion uniques monthly. We have about, call it ballpark, 4 billion page views a day. But every page view, people get to pages somehow, right? So maybe they searched, maybe they clicked on a link on Facebook. So we actually see how you got there. So at a point, we had like a very large fraction of searches we saw on the internet, like several times larger than all the small search engines combined. And so we could see effectively what everyone was searching for. And so we would put it up on a board, not by user, in fact, but like just anonymously. Like, what are the terms? And we try to cluster them. And what it taught me was, man, like the basics are really important. People are really looking for basic stuff all the time. Second thing I learned was, all of us spend a little bit more PT on the internet than we care to admit, because it was a massive percentage going to adult-oriented material, which I was like, okay, we're human. That happens. And so there would be these really awkward moments where we'd have an investor walk in. We had the screen up during board meetings, and I remember Ted walked in one day, and he's like, I'm not going to repeat what the query was, but let's just say that it was like probably one of the more obscene things I've ever heard him say. And I burst out laughing. So we took it down after that.
Now, I thought maybe you could give us some insight, because there's a lot of startups working sort of in that space, big data, and what sort of areas they can capitalize on, but it doesn't seem more. So one of the things that I had talked about just recently with some of the tech folks here was this whole privacy, and someone said, hey, it seems like the younger folks are they tend to like be more open with their private lives, and I heard on NPR, it's like that's actually not the case. It has nothing to do with age. It's actually knowledge. People who have better knowledge on technology, they're more open for their privacy, right? So, do you have things like that on AddThis?
So I have an interesting point of view on this, because I'm actually also working on a project in Stealth at Expo on the consumer side, which is a consumer, tool for sharing information. And so because of that, we've worked with a lot of college-age students. So what we found so far is interesting, and there's two things that are true at the same time, which are oppositional. One, people care less than they ever did about what the data on the internet, and we found that through research. I think people have generally started to accept, might be not the right word, but almost understand that there's a lot of people tracking their behavior for the purposes of online advertising. And a lot of people think, what they're doing is public by default. So what they're doing is censoring themselves, rather than saying, I want privacy controls from the network. I'm just assuming I have no privacy, and I'm doing that. So on that hand, people, and if you look at the volume of user-generated content, I mean, you're talking now at the level of like exabytes daily. So people are definitely sharing more, and it's exponential, in part because more people are on the internet. I think there's 3 billion now. There'll be 7, if you believe Eric Schmidt, by 2020. So that's everybody. So that's one point. The second point, though, it's interesting. Both, I believe, are true. So Snapchat. is now, I mean, I can't go into all their numbers, but let's just say ballpark, they have about 300 million users, right? And when we interviewed people, one of the things they loved is that they don't have to be accountable, and that they have a medium that's authentic, right? And so I think what's happening now is that there's a certain amount of privacy that I think people are willing to give up, but they are embracing certain private channels. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity in people who understand where to fit in that. The fact that both of those are true, and I don't exactly know all the products, but I can tell you there's going to be a lot of innovation there for sure, just because of the uncertainty. How can they both be true, right?
So what's sort of the future of AddThis? One of the reasons why I bring guests like you is because either could be potentially bought out or go IPO. So is there sort of a future in that direction?
I cannot comment on that, but the company is doing pretty well. We're fairly large in terms of the revenue and growing quickly. I believe last year our platform grew about 20%. So everything continues to be on the go, and the new team that came in about 2 years ago has been just alive and kicking. So we have free, premium, and enterprise, and all of those products are doing well. So, I mean, who knows? Honestly, a lot of this is going to be a function of the market. I don't know how it's impacting the DC area as much, but if you're on the West Coast, the valuations are insane, and things are just, it feels very frothy, so that could tip it either way, frankly.
If you could pick a company that would be a good acquirer, who would it be, if it could be anybody?
I've been partial to Google. I love Google. I think just because at least the entrepreneurs who came in the social wave, a lot of them, believe it or not, are very quants driven. So when you see the people that got viral products, even on social, they were very analytical. And I think that came from Google. And you just looked at them as the perfect company. I think Facebook might mean that for other people, but I know Facebook too well at this point, and I think Google's just, I don't know. It feels fun when you go there.
So the reason why I'm asking this is because two of the companies that we had here, it's the whole pattern recognition. Smart Things and Foundation DB. Smart Things got bought out by Samsung, and Foundation just got bought out by Apple. And so I look at your company, I look at AddThis, and I see sort of the same thing. And so we need those sort of wins in this area to sort of legitimize, the DC area. So that's what. So hopefully we'll see some great stuff. Well, who knows? Maybe Google might come over. I wanted to finally touch upon on the work that you're doing on EXPA. So EXPA, for those who don't know, is the fund from Garrett Kemp, right? Other ones, but the original, the founder of Uber, this is his fund. And so I'm kind of curious, like, what sort of investment strategy or themes that you guys are looking at? I mean, he's sort of like in this whole on-demand workforce. I mean, that's sort of like what Uber is. Are you guys sort of looking into that as sort of the new economy, so to speak?
So for those of you guys that are not familiar with EXPA, because we're relatively new, we're a startup studio based in San Francisco. We have offices in New York as well. So it's a partner. Have you guys know BetaWorks is by any chance? Have you heard of BetaWorks? Show of hands. Oh, no one. Okay, one. So basically the idea is we have a fund. It's about $50 million. There's 3 partners who can deploy out of the fund, and we build new companies. And so we've done them in a number of ways. Some of them are our own ideas. Some of them we've partnered with people that have come up with ideas. So we're very early in the model, but the idea is we do very few things, and we actually help build. So we have in-house people that work on that. So we have, for example, our designer in residence was the first designer at Twitter, and he's building a new project with someone. 2 of the companies that we've put out that you may have heard of are Reserve and also a company called Operator. And I think when you look at things that right now, at least version 1, we focus very much on consumer internet. We do have one enterprise company in the business intelligence space that'll be coming soon, but mostly consumer internet, just because Naveen had founded Foursquare and Garrett started Uber on Stumble, so a lot of the inertia is there, and also the cost of bootstrapping those businesses is relatively low. We've been looking at, for our second fund, some more aggressive plays. But yeah, there is actually another on-demand thing that we're working on. So, and I've invested in, I think, 3 on-demand companies, 4 4 on-demand companies at this point. And Garrett obviously did the on-demand company, so he did the Uber of Uber.
So like Uber of that's going to interest you guys, right? I mean, because there's house cleaning, there's mechanics. There's there's Thumbtack that does sort of like on demand for contractors, drivers delivery on demand delivery. It seems like this is going to be a pretty big, generator of jobs. So, I mean, I'd figure, with Garrett as sort of the co-founder of Uber, and every single, I mean, I'm serious, like half the pitch I hear is like, hey, we're Uber for this or the Airbnb for that. It seems like there's a lot of interest in that space.
So one thing I'll tell you about the on-demand ecosystem, I think it represents a systemic shift in a lot of industries moving from this ownership model to rental. So I would even say Spotify and some of these other companies are part of this broader movement, which is you're seeing a big movement away from ownership to just renting. And there's a lot more, non-committal relationships with companies these days, right? I don't want to buy stuff. I don't want to own all this crap. I want to be able to, optionality is key. And in particular, if you look at millennials, they have good reason to think that, right? They've just had a crappy time after the recession. They don't know what's going to come next. And, it's easier to just buy it as you're going, right? And so I think a lot of that is stemming from some of this economic stuff, but it's going to be very big. And I think there's a lot more. It's always surprising. You think it's done. But one area we're very heavily interested in, as you can imagine with Uber, is transportation. Another area we've been looking in recently is food. So for some newer stuff, what do you do every day, right? You got to get places and you got to eat. So those businesses, when you look at the markets, as an example, trucking, it's a $3 trillion industry worldwide, right? $3 trillion. So if you look at the online advertising marketplace, it's ballpark $150 billion. So Facebook and Google, look at their combined market caps. You're talking about $500 million market cap against that market, which is huge, and it's going to go to $500 billion, but that's nothing compared to $3 trillion. And Uber right now is now participating in the $2 trillion transportation market. They literally, it's crazy. In theory, could have no ceiling, especially with driverless cars as the unit economics change. So,
are you guys looking into driverless car technology?
No comment. Go to Pittsburgh. Go to Pittsburgh. You'll see. I can say that.
What are sort of the other mega trends? Are you guys interested in droids, Bitcoin, other mega trends that interest you guys?
Honestly, right now, I think, to be intellectually honest, we're just looking for solid businesses that we can build with people. Expa is a co-founder in projects. So unlike a venture capitalist where they hand you a check and they peace out, we actually partner with people. So Garrett actually helped work on Operator. He helped work on Reserve. He was working on the site. There are things that people do, and his team was working on that. So it's a little different over time. And we are discussing, a little bit more lighter, some relationships, much like BetaWorks, maybe some investment, just to start building relationships and things like that. But I think you'll see some interesting things coming from us, even starting this summer.
Okay, I have one more question before we open up the floor to Q&A. I always ask all of our speakers here. I know that you sort of spend most of your time in the Valley, Silicon Valley. You're here in DC. So obviously the greener pastures over there, but you saw that DC was a great place because you passed New York. So what makes DC tech? What makes it so special? Why do you think DC is better than, say, New York or even Silicon Valley?
I think so. I got asked this question several times when I first came here, when I was staying here, when I moved to San Francisco. Not being a native of the area, but I don't think better and worse are the right words because I think it's very absolute, and only Siths think in absolutes. Anyone get that one? But no. Anyway, that was too dorky for this audience. My bad. You gotta try. You gotta try some zingers. It works in the Valley. I swear to God. So anyway, I think Silicon Valley, at the end of the day, on an absolute scale, clearly has the most VC dollars, most management, most engineers. So just from if you want to just go on an absolute basis, it's good. But one of the trade-offs there is it's harder to get visibility. The churn is higher on your team. It's insane what you pay for a developer. That's not good. Whereas here, the churn is low on developers, more loyalty, maybe a smaller base of institutional investors. And there is a benefit, honestly, to not being subject to this buzz. Like I've already seen in board meetings, just, oh, I read on TechCrunch this, and we should be looking at that. And it's like every single meeting, that same investor has like this different TechCrunch article that they're referencing. And you almost want to record them and snapshot them and be like, you know how crazy this sounds? It's just, so there's less of that here. So I think it depends on what kind of business you want to build. I think it depends on what kind of entrepreneur you are, whether you pick DC, New York, San Francisco, what your company is. So, and there are epicenters in certain industries. So if you're in marketing technology and advertising technology, New York is really favorable. But being in DC, for us at least, was nice because we could keep a lot of our strong technical team, and it's a 2-hour train ride away. So that was actually not that challenging.
One more question before opening up, because I'm the interviewer, because I'm going to ask as many questions. What is the biggest mistake you've ever made, and how did you recover from it?
Trying to think of something humiliating because you guys stayed here so late. What is the biggest mistake that I made? Biggest mistake. There's so many. I'm not pausing because I haven't made mistakes. I don't even know.
What's your favorite biggest mistake? How about that?
Favorite biggest mistake in a business? Okay, I'm like.
Well, we could open it up to personal if you want. Go ahead.
Yeah. In business, I would say, okay, so I would say some of the mistakes that are most instructive. I'll do that because that's actually, you can learn something versus just laugh. I think one of the things that I did as an early entrepreneur, so we had, when we were first doing sharing, everything was all about widgets. Everyone was sharing widgets and all this other stuff. And this is kind of when Nigel first started getting involved, and we were not a data-informed business. We definitely looked at metrics. We definitely tracked it, but it wasn't like a hypothesis-driven loop. Like, oh, okay, well, if we do this, this is going to move by this much, and okay, let's roll back the test. Did we succeed or fail? It wasn't that deterministic. It was a little bit more seat of your pants. And I think one of the mistakes I made was, and this is ironic given the company that I have, was that I didn't use data at all. At the very beginning, we were just flying. I was, because I was right a couple times, so I was like, oh, I'm awesome. And then when I was wrong, I was like really wrong, and I think we lost like $1 million on this product that I launched. So that was bad. I think is that bad enough? I think that's pretty bad. Yeah.
$1 million. We're going to open up the floor for questions. So first of all, are there any VIPs or City Pass members? Okay, it's Jeff. He's always here. So, all right. First question. I think we're going to have time for maybe 2. So, okay, here we go.
You said that culture is very important to a company, and it's kind of easy to hear a successful company say culture is important. You hear like the Zapposes, they're saying culture is everything to us, and it's like, yeah, you're profitable. It's easy to have a cool culture when you're profitable. Go back to your early days when it was just you and a handful of guys. I worked for 2 years bootstrapping my company before I ever had a team, and I know some of my customers ask, how do I have a culture when it's just me and I can't really grow beyond me? So go back to those early days. How did you do culture? Maybe if you were in a virtual environment or you didn't really have an office, you couldn't afford a foosball table, whatever it was. What are some steps to doing culture when you're small still?
So I love this point because I think it illustrates part of the way that culture gets confused with amenities. So I didn't have food at the beginning or foosball tables. I mean, we didn't even have chairs for like a year. We had bean bags. So I think people confuse the cool stuff that Google as an example, like sets the bar, right? Free lunches, haircuts, laundry, all that cool stuff. Those are amenities. That's not a culture. A cultural item, for example, is transparency, right? If you ask me a question, I will answer it, right? So if you came in my office and said, how much cash do we have left? I'm going to answer it. That's culture. If you say, hey, we're going to really embrace openness and everyone can submit ideas. I can't tell you the amount of things that I heard that were just so bad as a result of that, but you have to live it, right? I have people coming in who just presented things that were ill-conceived or wrong or whatever you can imagine, and I don't mean wrong like just wrong like mentally wrong like. So I think that's culture, right? Like you have to stand by those principles. It's kind of like the Constitution, right? So what do you believe? And there's like 4 or 5 of those things, and you can have that with one person, right? And you can see it imbued in a brand. right? Like what that brand means, what it feels like. Uber has a culture of service, right? Your personal driver, right? It's sleek. It's about high quality experience. And what's the difference between Lyft and Uber X? Why do people hit that button? Well, it's Uber. It must be better. I mean, it's because that reflects in their brand. So I think I'd separate out, like you can start stacking amenities, but don't confuse those with culture because, you hit a recession, that stuff goes away. Like, what are you about? So
I think we have time for one more question. Or two. Okay, here we go. Or afterwards.
Yes. Hi, this is Tiziana. So you clearly have figured out real time. So what about geolocations coupled with real time?
Geolocation, you're saying, with AddThis? Yeah, actually, we figured that out first. So that one we have. We just, it's an interesting data set for us because a lot of the initial audience personalization, we started on the desktop, so it wasn't that important to our advertisers. In the mobile context, it's critical. So we have it. We have it. Geolocation. Oh, so we have the data point, sorry, in terms of us collecting the data point. The only use case that we've applied it to thus far is in our personalization products, which are typically to enterprise.
Oh, I thought you were going to have a longer answer. I think we have time for one more question.
Some can be short.
Okay, all right. I don't think anyone would have questions. So I have two more questions to ask. If you can go back 15 years ago, you're sitting in front of a badass entrepreneur, what would be the single most important advice you would give to yourself?
Listen twice as much as you talk.
Is that it? That's your final answer? Okay, great. I like that. I think that's a tweetable moment, by the way. And then one last question: who is your favorite superhero and why?
My why is going to be convoluted but obvious. Tony Stark, Iron Man, and I mean, I don't know about you guys, but come on. Engineer turned entrepreneur turned superhero. It's like the progression, right? I have something to shoot for. So I told Garrett straight up, if we're not working on Iron Man suits in 10 years, then we're doing the wrong stuff.
Can we be beta users for those suits?
I'll let you know. I'm pushing it.
So obviously you told me this answer, and I'm glad you told me it was Iron Man because in the past, some guests have given me weird ones, and I had to look all over eBay. But yours was easy. So I got you Tony Stark, Iron Man, start with the Stark Grind swag on there. So here we go. So ladies and gentlemen, Hooman Radfar, thank you for coming out. Thank you.